The mahogany wardrobe stood against the wall of Rachel Morrison's studio apartment like an accusation. Too large for the space, too ornate for the peeling paint and water-stained ceiling, too permanent for someone who'd been evicted twice in the past year. It dominated the single room, forcing her bed into a corner and her kitchen table against the window, where morning light had to squeeze past its bulk to reach anything else. Her sister's voice still echoed in her head from 3 days ago, sharp with the particular cruelty that only family can deliver with precision. "You're actually keeping that monstrosity? Rachel, for God's sake, be practical for once in your life." Rachel had been standing in their grandmother's house then, surrounded by relatives picking through Estelle Morrison's belongings like vultures at a carcass. The funeral had been that morning. By afternoon, the family had descended on the small brick house in Philadelphia's Fishtown neighborhood, claiming everything that might have value. Her cousin Derek had taken the silverware. Aunt Patricia had loaded her SUV with china that had sat and used in cabinets for 40 years. Uncle James had pocketed the vintage watches, the gold cufflinks, anything small enough to slip into a jacket without announcement. And Rachel had stood in front of the wardrobe, her grandmother's most cherished possession, and said simply, "I want this." The room had gone quiet. Then the laughter started. That old thing. Derek had sneered, running his hand over the carved wood with theatrical disdain. "It's probably full of termites. Worth more as firewood." "It weighs a ton," Patricia added, her voice dripping with false concern. "How are you even going to move it? You can't afford movers. Where exactly do you plan to put it?" Her sister Vanessa had crossed her arms, her designer handbag dangling from one elbow like a weapon. "In that shoebox you're renting? The one you can barely afford?" Rachel had ignored them all. She'd run her fingers over the same carved flowers her grandmother had touched for 60 years, feeling the smooth wood worn soft by time and hands. She'd opened the heavy doors, breathed in the scent of cedar and lavender sachets, and remembered being 7 years old, hiding inside while Grandma, Estelle, pretended not to know where she was. "This is what I want," she'd repeated, quieter this time. They'd let her have it, not out of generosity, but out of contempt. Why fight over something nobody wanted? Let Rachel waste her time with a piece of furniture too big to move and too old-fashioned to sell. It was fitting, really. She'd always been the impractical one, the dreamer, the failure who couldn't get her life together. That had been 3 days ago. Now the wardrobe stood in her apartment, and Rachel stood in front of it at 2 o'clock in the morning, unable to sleep, wondering if her family had been right. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of someone's television through the thin walls. October rain tapped against the window with patient persistence. The radiator clanked occasionally, releasing heat in grudging bursts that never quite reached the corners of the room. Rachel was 32 years old, though some mornings she felt 60. She'd lost her job as a museum archivist 4 months ago when the small historical society she worked for lost its funding. The severance had lasted 6 weeks. Her savings had evaporated paying rent and the minimum on credit cards that now sent her reminder texts daily, cheerful little pings announcing her mounting debt. She'd applied for 37 positions in the past 3 months. She knew the exact number because she kept a spreadsheet tracking applications like someone tracking a disease. The responses had been uniformly disappointing. Most never replied at all. The few that did sent automated rejections so impersonal they might as well have been addressed to occupant. Rent was due in 5 days. She had $43 in her checking account and half a jar of peanut butter in the cupboard. The eviction notice would come again, the 3rd time in 18 months, and this time she didn't have anywhere left to go. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text from Vanessa. "Talk to a dealer. He'd give you $200 for the wardrobe if you can get it to him. Better than nothing. Think about it." Rachel stared at the message, her jaw tight. $200. For a piece her grandmother had treasured more than anything else she owned. For the wardrobe Estelle had brought from Poland in 1962, paying for extra cargo space on a boat when she barely had money for passage herself. Rachel remembered the stories. How Estelle had been 17 when she'd left Warsaw, fleeing a country that had tried to erase her family, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and the promise that someday somehow, her family's wardrobe would follow. It had taken 3 years, 3 different shipping companies, and money she'd earned scrubbing floors in New York, but she'd brought it over. Piece by piece, panel by panel, reassembled in a tiny apartment in Brooklyn where 6 people shared 4 rooms. "This is not furniture," Estelle used to say, her accent still thick even after 50 years in America. "This is history. This is family. This is what survives when everything else is lost." Rachel deleted Vanessa's text without responding. She approached the wardrobe slowly, running her hand over the carved surface. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, even she could see that. The wood was mahogany, dark and rich, aged to a deep burgundy that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The carving covered every visible surface, intricate patterns of flowers, vines, and geometric designs that interlocked with mathematical precision. The doors were heavy, each one at least 3 inches thick, hung on brass hinges that had been polished smooth by decades of opening and closing. The handles were ornate, cast brass formed into the shape of flowering branches, worn soft where hands had gripped them most often. Inside, the wardrobe was divided into sections. Upper shelves for folded items, lower drawers with dovetail joints that slid smoothly despite their age, a hanging rod made of solid brass rather than the cheap chrome tubing of modern closets. The back panel was solid wood, not the thin plywood most furniture makers use now, and it was carved too, though more simply, with a repeating pattern of interlocking circles. Rachel had been inside this wardrobe 100 times as a child. She'd hidden there during games, retreated there when family gatherings became overwhelming, sat curled in the bottom with the doors slightly open, breathing in cedar and feeling safe in a way she hadn't felt anywhere else. She opened the doors now, stepping back to let them swing wide. The interior light from her apartment fell across the hanging space, and she noticed something she'd never paid attention to before. The wardrobe was deep, very deep. She frowned, stepping closer. From the outside, the piece appeared to be maybe 2 feet from front to back. Standard depth for a wardrobe, proportional to its height and width. But looking inside, the space seemed deeper, extending further back than the exterior dimension suggested. She reached inside, running her hand along the bottom of the hanging space until her fingers touched the back panel. Then she turned, eyeing the wall behind the wardrobe. There was maybe 4 inches of space between the furniture and the wall. She'd had to angle it carefully to fit it through the apartment door. But if the back panel was where her hand currently rested, and the wall was only 4 inches behind the exterior, then the math didn't work. There should be more wall visible. Unless... Rachel pulled her hand back, looking at the interior more carefully. The hanging rod was about 18 inches from the back panel. The shelves above were the same depth, but the exterior of the wardrobe measured at least 30 inches from front to back. She'd watched the movers measure it, cursing the dimensions as they'd figured out how to navigate the narrow stairwell. She was missing almost a foot of space. She sat down on her bed, which was really just a mattress on the floor, and stared at the wardrobe with new attention. Could there be a hidden compartment? It seemed like something out of a movie, too dramatic for real life. But then again, Estelle had come from a country where people hid things as a matter of survival, where secret spaces and furniture had saved lives and preserved treasures when everything else was being destroyed. The thought made Rachel's heart beat faster. She stood, approaching the wardrobe again, this time running her hands over every surface of the interior. She pressed against the back panel, expecting it to shift or reveal a seam. Nothing happened. She examined the shelves, the drawers, the side panels. Everything appeared solid, seamless, exactly as it should be, but the missing space nagged at her. She pulled out her phone, ignoring the 3% battery warning, and turned on the flashlight. She directed the beam into the wardrobe, examining the back panel more closely. The carved pattern of interlocking circles was consistent, each circle touching the ones beside it, creating a continuous flow across the entire surface. Except in one place. Near the bottom left corner, one of the circles was slightly different. Not obviously so, not enough to notice unless you were looking carefully, but the carving was a fraction shallower. The wood grain didn't quite match, and there was the faintest line around its perimeter, barely visible, like a pencil mark that had been almost but not entirely erased. Rachel knelt, bringing her face close to the panel. She pressed against the circle. Nothing. She tried turning it. Nothing. She pushed harder and felt the slightest give, as if the wood had compressed a millimeter before springing back. She tried pushing and turning simultaneously. The circle rotated smoothly, silently, revealing itself to be a concealed mechanism rather than decorative carving. After a quarter turn, there was a soft click from somewhere deep inside the wardrobe, and the entire back panel shifted inward a fraction of an inch. Rachel froze, her hand still on the circle, her breath caught in her throat. The panel had moved. Not much, maybe half an inch, but enough to reveal that it wasn't attached to the frame the way it appeared to be. She pushed gently against the panel. It swung inward like a door, revealing darkness beyond. Her phone battery died, plunging the room into the dim orange glow of street lights filtering through rain-streaked windows. Rachel stood quickly, nearly hitting her head on the hanging rod, and rushed to the kitchen drawer where she kept a small flashlight she'd bought at a dollar store 6 months ago. She'd used it exactly twice, both times during power outages. Her hand shook as she clicked it on. The beam was weak, yellow rather than white, but it was enough. She returned to the wardrobe, kneeling again, and directed the light into the space beyond the false back panel. The beam revealed a cavity maybe 10 inches deep, extending the full width and height of the wardrobe's interior. It was lined with what looked like velvet, dark blue or black, aged and slightly dusty. And it wasn't empty. Rachel reached inside, her fingers touching something wrapped in cloth. She pulled it out carefully, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. The object was heavy, compact, about the size of a brick, but irregular in shape. She carried it to the table by the window and unwrapped the cloth with trembling hands. Inside was a wooden box, plain and unadorned, with a simple latch. The wood was light, probably pine, and very old, its surface smooth from handling but unpolished. She opened the latch. Inside, nestled in more velvet, was a leather pouch. It was tied with a cord that had stiffened with age. Rachel's fingers fumbled with the knot, finally loosening it enough to pull the pouch open. She tilted the pouch over her palm, and a single stone fell out. Even in the weak light of the dollar store flashlight and the orange glow from the street, it caught brilliance and threw it back. Clear, perfectly faceted, catching light from sources Rachel couldn't even identify and transforming it into rainbow fire. A diamond. Rachel set it carefully on the table, her hand shaking so badly the stone seemed to vibrate. She reached into the pouch again, and another stone fell out. Then another, and another. 12 diamonds in total, each one different in size and cut, but all of them real, all of them brilliant, all of them impossible. She stared at them, her mind struggling to accept what her eyes were seeing. This couldn't be real. People didn't find diamonds hidden in old furniture. This was someone's costume jewelry, glass or crystal, something with sentimental value, but no actual worth. But even as she thought it, she knew she was wrong. She'd spent 4 years working at the Historical Society, cataloging estates, examining items people swore were valuable that turned out to be reproductions or worthless curiosities. She'd learned to recognize quality, to spot the difference between real and fake. These were real. She wrapped them carefully back in the leather pouch, her hand steadier now, and returned to the wardrobe. If there was one pouch, there might be more. She directed the flashlight into the hidden cavity again, and her breath caught. The space was full, not packed tightly, but deliberately arranged. More wrapped bundles, more wooden boxes, small leather cases with tarnished brass clasps. She could see at least a dozen objects, maybe more in the shadows. Rachel pulled out another bundle, then another, carrying them to the table with reverent care. She unwrapped each one methodically, her shock giving way to a strange calm focus, as if her brain had decided that the impossibility of what was happening meant normal emotional responses didn't apply. The second box contained 15 diamonds, larger than the first set. The third held 20. A leather case revealed a necklace, diamonds set in platinum so delicate it looked like lace. The stones graded from small at the clasp to a central stone the size of Rachel's thumbnail. Another case held a pair of earrings, each one featuring a diamond cut in a style Rachel didn't recognize, surrounded by smaller stones arranged in a sunburst pattern. She kept pulling items out, kept unwrapping them, kept discovering more. Bracelets, rings, loose stones wrapped individually in silk. A tiara that looked like something from a historical costume drama, but which gleamed with authenticity that costume pieces never achieved. By the time she'd emptied the hidden cavity, the table was covered. 23 separate items or collections, each one containing multiple diamonds. Some pieces were jewelry, expertly crafted, clearly meant to be worn by someone with wealth and status. Others were loose stones, carefully graded and wrapped, as if someone had been collecting them with the intention of having them set later. Rachel sat at her kitchen table as dawn light began to replace the orange streetlight glow, surrounded by diamonds that shouldn't exist, that couldn't be hers, that her grandmother had hidden in a wardrobe and never mentioned to anyone. Her phone, plugged in and charging, buzzed with morning texts. Vanessa asking if she'd thought about the $200 offer. Her landlord reminding her that rent was due Friday. A notification from her bank warning her that her account was below the minimum balance. All of it felt distant now, existing in a different reality than the one she currently occupied. She thought about her grandmother, about Estelle arriving in America with nothing, working brutal hours in jobs that destroyed her health, living in cramped apartments where 6 people shared space meant for 2. She thought about the stories Estelle had told, always vague, always stopping before they reached certain points. "We lost everything in the war," Estelle would say. "Everything but what we carried." Rachel had always assumed that meant they'd lost material possessions, furniture and houses, and the ordinary accumulation of middle-class life. But now, looking at the table covered in diamonds, she wondered if the story had been more complicated than that. What if everything but what we carried had been literal? What if these diamonds had been carried, hidden, transported across continents and decades, preserved through chaos and displacement? The wardrobe had come from Poland in 1962, 15 years after Estelle herself had arrived. Had the diamonds been hidden inside, even then? Had they made that journey across the Atlantic, concealed in a false back panel, while customs officials examined the exterior and waved it through? Rachel realized she was crying, though she wasn't sure when the tears had started. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of dust across her cheek. Estelle had died 3 weeks ago, peacefully in her sleep at 89 years old. The funeral had been small. The family had been respectful, but not grieving. Not really. Estelle had been old, increasingly confused in her final years, a burden to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. Only Rachel had cried. Only Rachel had stood at the grave and felt like something irreplaceable had been lost. And now this impossible inheritance, hidden where no one would find it unless they knew to look, preserve in a piece of furniture everyone else had dismissed as worthless junk. Rachel's hands were still shaking as she began wrapping the diamonds again, carefully returning each item to its original packaging. She worked slowly, methodically, treating each piece with the reverence it deserved. When everything was rewrapped, she carried it all back to the wardrobe and began placing items into the hidden cavity exactly as she'd found them. But before closing the false back panel, she paused. There was something else in the cavity, something she'd missed in her initial excitement. A small envelope, yellowed with age, tucked against the side panel where it would have been hidden even if someone had found the cavity. She pulled it out carefully. The envelope was thin, the paper brittle. On the front, written in handwriting she recognized immediately as her grandmother's, were 3 words in Polish, Dla Moje Nuxki. For my granddaughter. Rachel's vision blurred. She carried the envelope to the table, sat down, and opened it with infinite care. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Estelle's careful script, written in English, but with the formal precision of someone who had learned the language as an adult and never fully trusted its casual rules. My dear Rachel, it began. If you're reading this, then I am gone, and you have found what I have kept hidden all these years. I hoped you would be the one. You were always the one who loved this wardrobe, who understood that some things matter more than their function. What you have found was my mother's, and her mother's before that. Our family was not poor before the war. We were jewelers in Warsaw, respected craftsmen who made pieces for people with names you would recognize from history books. We had wealth, position, a beautiful home in a good neighborhood. When the Germans came, we knew what was coming. My father took every piece we had created but not sold, every diamond we had in inventory, every precious stone that represented 3 generations of work. He separated them from their settings, hid them in ways that would not be detected. Some he sewed into coat linings. Some he hid in hollow boot heels. And the rest, the most valuable pieces, he concealed in this wardrobe. It was my mother's dowry piece, made by her father when she married. The false back was added then, a place for her to keep valuables safe. It saved us. Not everyone survived. My father did not. My brother did not. But my mother and I did, and we brought the diamonds with us. First to Austria, then to England, finally to America. Each time we moved, the wardrobe came too, shipped separately, arriving weeks or months after we did. People thought we were foolish to spend money on furniture when we had so little. They did not know what the furniture contained. In America, we could have sold them. We could have lived comfortably, bought a big house, sent me to the finest schools. But my mother refused. This is not money, she told me. This is survival. This is insurance against the next catastrophe, because there is always a next catastrophe. We keep them safe for the granddaughters who do not exist yet, so that when the world turns dark again, they will have something to carry forward. I honored her wish. I lived simply, worked hard, saved what I could, and I kept the diamonds hidden, waiting for the right person to receive them. Not Vanessa, who measures worth in dollars and sees love as a transaction. Not your cousins, who would sell them in a week and waste the money on things that don't matter. You, Rachel, because you understand that some things are worth keeping, even when keeping them is difficult, even when everyone else thinks you're foolish. What you do with them is your choice. Sell them if you must. Keep them if you can. But remember what they represent. They are not jewelry. They are survival. They are proof that beauty can endure through horror, that value can be preserved through loss, that families can protect what matters most even when everything else is taken away. You have always been the keeper of stories, Rachel. The one who asked questions, who wanted to understand where we came from and why it mattered. Now you have more than stories. You have the physical proof of everything I told you. Our family survived because we were clever, because we were brave, because we understood that true wealth is not what you display, but what you protect. Be brave now. Be clever. And when you look at these stones, remember that they represent not just value, but choice. The choice to survive with dignity. The choice to preserve beauty in a world that tries to destroy it. The choice to pass forward something worth having, not just money, but meaning. I love you, my dear girl. You are always my favorite, though I try not to show it. Live well, live bravely, and when the dark times come, because they always do, remember that you come from people who knew how to carry light through darkness. Your grandmother, Estelle Morrison. Written April 3rd, 2019. Rachel set the letter down carefully, her hands shaking too badly to hold it safely. She leaned forward, resting her forehead on her folded arms, and let herself cry. Not the quiet tears of grief, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Everything she'd thought about her life, about her failures, about her inability to be practical and successful like Vanessa, all of it was reframed by those words. She wasn't the failure. She was the keeper. She was the one Estelle had trusted, not because she was successful, but because she understood what mattered. Outside, the rain had stopped. Early morning light filled the apartment, soft and gray, illuminating the wardrobe that dominated the space. It didn't look like an intrusion anymore. It looked like what it was, a fortress, a vault, a piece of family history that had survived everything the 20th century could throw at it and emerged intact. Rachel stood slowly, her body aching from the hours she'd spent kneeling and reaching. She returned the letter to its envelope, placed it carefully in the hidden cavity alongside the wrapped diamonds, and closed the false back panel. The mechanism clicked softly, and the panel settled perfectly into place, invisible again unless you knew where to look. She closed the wardrobe doors, running her hand over the carved wood one more time. Then she pulled out her phone and deleted Vanessa's message without reading it again. Rent was still due in 5 days. Her bank account still had only $43. The eviction notice would still come if she didn't pay. But everything had changed. She had choices now. Real ones, not just the desperate scrambling between bad options that had defined the past 4 months. She could sell 1 diamond, maybe 2, and buy herself time. Pay the rent, buy food, survive long enough to figure out what came next. But first, she needed to know what she actually had. She needed someone who could look at these stones and tell her their value, their history, whether they were as extraordinary as they appeared or just very good fakes that had fooled 3 generations of her family. She sat at her computer, which was old enough that it took 3 minutes to boot up, and began searching for diamond appraisers in Philadelphia. Not the chain stores and malls, not the pawn shops that advertised on bus benches, but legitimate gemologists with credentials and reputations. The search returned dozens of results. She began filtering them, reading reviews, checking certifications, looking for someone who seemed trustworthy. It was still only 7 in the morning, too early to call anyone, but she bookmarked 5 possibilities and began drafting an email that would explain her situation without sounding insane. I have inherited several pieces of diamond jewelry and would like to have them appraised for insurance purposes. Could you recommend a time for a consultation? Simple, professional, reasonable. No mention of hidden panels or family secrets or 3 generations of survival. Just a normal request from a normal person who happened to have some valuable items. She sent the email to all 5 appraisers, then sat back and looked at the wardrobe again. "Thank you, Grandma," she whispered. "I understand now. I'll protect them the way you did. I promise." The apartment was quiet except for the familiar sounds of morning. Water running in upstairs units, someone's alarm going off and being repeatedly snoozed, traffic beginning to build on the street below. Rachel should have been exhausted. She'd been awake all night. Her emotions had cycled through shock and grief and wonder so many times she'd lost count. But she felt energized, alert, her mind racing through possibilities and plans. She wouldn't tell anyone. Not yet. Not Vanessa. Not the cousins. Not anyone who'd been at the estate settlement and seen her take the wardrobe. Let them think she was foolish. Let them laugh about how she'd wasted her time on worthless furniture. They'd never know, never understand what they dismissed. The thought brought a smile to her face, the first genuine smile she'd managed in weeks. They'd all been so sure she was making a mistake, so confident in their judgment, so quick to mock her impractical choice. And they'd all been wrong. Rachel stood, stretched her back, and began making coffee. The ritual of it grounded her, gave her hands something to do while her mind continued processing. She poured water into the machine she'd bought at a thrift store, measured out ground from a bag she'd stretched over 2 weeks, and listened to the familiar gurgle and hiss as it brewed. The smell filled the apartment, mixing with the faint scent of cedar that emanated from the wardrobe. She poured a cup, added the last of her milk, and sat at the table with her laptop. While she waited for responses from the appraisers, she began researching her family's history. She'd heard Estelle's stories, but she'd never investigated them, never tried to verify the details or fill in the gaps. Now she wanted to know everything. She found records of Jewish families in Warsaw before the war, lists of businesses and addresses. She found her family's jewelry shop mentioned in a historical register. Rothstein and Sons, fine jewelers, established 1887. Her great-great-grandfather had founded it. 3 generations had run it, each son training under his father, learning the craft that had sustained them. She found the address, now East Waite Street, in the heart of Warsaw's commercial district. The building no longer existed. The entire neighborhood had been destroyed during the war, then rebuilt completely different, modern and efficient, and bearing no trace of what had been there before. She found immigration records. Estelle Rothstein, age 17, arriving in New York in 1947, alone, listed as a refugee. Occupation: none. Sponsor: Jewish Refugee Relief Society. She found more records. Estelle's mother, Sarah Rothstein, arriving in 1953, age 53, also alone, also listed as a refugee. Between 1947 and 1953, Sarah had been in England, in a displacement camp, waiting for permission to enter America. Rachel felt her throat tighten as she imagined those years. Mother and daughter, separated by an ocean, both displaced, both starting over with nothing. Except they had something. They'd had the diamonds, hidden and waiting, preserved through chaos and loss. The wardrobe had arrived in 1962, 9 years after Sarah. Rachel found the shipping manifest: antique furniture, wooden wardrobe, sender, S. Rothstein, London. Recipient, S. Rothstein, Brooklyn. Sarah had kept it in London for 15 years, waiting until she was settled enough in America to pay for the shipping, to receive it safely. The cost would have been significant, especially for someone working as a seamstress in Brooklyn. But she'd paid it because the wardrobe wasn't just furniture. It was a vault, and what it contained was worth more than years of wages. Rachel closed her laptop and sat in silence, holding her coffee cup with both hands, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. She understood now what Estelle had meant in the letter. The diamonds weren't money. They were proof. Proof that their family had been something before the war had tried to erase them. Proof that they'd been clever enough to save what mattered. Proof that beauty and value could survive even when the world descended into madness. Her phone buzzed. An email notification. One of the appraisers had responded already. Dear Ms. Morrison, thank you for your inquiry. I have availability this afternoon at 2 p.m. if that suits you. Please bring the items with you, along with any documentation of provenance if available. My office is located at the address below. Looking forward to meeting you. Best regards, David Eisenberg, GIA, certified gemologist. Rachel checked the address. It was in Center City, about 40 minutes by subway from her apartment. She had $4 in her wallet and a transit pass that still had 3 days before it expired. She could make the appointment. She typed a response accepting the time, then sat back and looked at the wardrobe one more time. Everything was about to change. She could feel it, the same way you can feel a storm building before the first drop of rain falls. Whatever happened next, whatever these diamonds turned out to be worth, whatever choices she had to make, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her grandmother had chosen her for a reason. Not Vanessa with her practical success and expensive tastes. Not the cousins who measured everything in dollars and dismissed what they couldn't immediately value. Her, Rachel Morrison, the failure, the impractical dreamer, the granddaughter who'd hidden in the wardrobe as a child and understood that some things were worth keeping even when everyone else thought they were worthless. She finished her coffee, washed the cup carefully, and began preparing for her appointment. She selected 3 items from the hidden cavity: the leather pouch with the 12 loose stones, the diamond necklace, and one of the bracelets. Enough to get an accurate appraisal. Not so much that she'd be walking around the city carrying a fortune that would make her target. She wrapped each item carefully in soft cloth, then placed them in her backpack alongside her grandmother's letter. The provenance Eisenberg had asked for. Proof that these weren't stolen, weren't fakes, weren't the desperate delusion of someone who couldn't tell glass from diamonds. At 1 p.m., she left the apartment, locking the door behind her and checking it twice out of habit. The wardrobe remained inside, massive and immovable, guarding what was left with the same patient strength it had shown for over 60 years. Rachel took the subway into Center City, her backpack pressed against her chest, her awareness sharp despite the exhaustion that was finally catching up with her. She watched every person who got too close, every hand that moved near her bag, every eye that lingered too long. The address led her to a professional building with a doorman who checked her name against a list before waving her through. David Eisenberg's office was on the 4th floor, a small suite with his name etched on a brass plate beside a door that looked heavier than it needed to be. She pushed it open and stepped into a space that was designed to project both expertise and discretion. Dark wood furniture, track lighting positioned to illuminate without glare, a large desk with nothing on it except a lamp and a jeweler's loupe. David Eisenberg stood when she entered. He was maybe 60, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His hands were steady and clean, his nails trimmed short in the way of someone who worked with delicate objects and couldn't risk snagging or scratching. "Ms. Morrison," he said, extending his hand. "Please have a seat." Rachel shook his hand and sat in the chair he indicated. Her backpack remained on her lap, her arms wrapped around it protectively. "I appreciate you seeing me on such short notice," she said, her voice more steady than she felt. "Not at all. Your email suggested a matter of some importance." He settled into his own chair and folded his hands on the desk. "What can I help you with today?" Rachel took a breath and began explaining, carefully, choosing her words with the precision her grandmother's letter had taught her. She told him about inheriting the wardrobe, about discovering the hidden panel, about finding items she believed were valuable but needed expert verification. She pulled out the wrapped bundles and set them on his desk one by one. Then she pulled out the letter and placed it beside them. "This is from my grandmother. It explains where the items came from and why they were hidden. I thought you should see it before examining anything else." Eisenberg read the letter slowly, his expression neutral but attentive. When he finished, he set it down carefully and looked at Rachel with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he said quietly, "and you were right to bring this documentation. Provenance matters, especially for items like these." He reached for the first bundle, unwrapping it with practiced care. The 12 loose diamonds spilled onto a black velvet pad he'd pulled from a drawer. He adjusted his lamp, picked up his loupe, and began examining them one by one. Rachel watched in silence. Minutes passed. Eisenberg said nothing, his focus absolute. He moved from stone to stone, occasionally making a small sound of interest or surprise, but offering no commentary. Finally, he set down the loupe and looked at her. "Ms. Morrison, where exactly did you say you found these?" "In my grandmother's wardrobe, in a hidden compartment behind the back panel." "And you've never had them examined before?" "No, I found them yesterday. You're the first person I've shown them to." He nodded slowly, his expression still neutral. "I need to examine the other pieces as well before I can give you a complete assessment." "May I?" "Yes, of course." He unwrapped the necklace next, laying it out on the velvet with a gentleness that bordered on reverence. Then the bracelet. He examined both with the same focused attention, taking measurements, checking clasps and settings, studying each stone individually. Rachel waited, her hands clenched in her lap, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it across the desk. After what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 30 minutes, Eisenberg set down his loupe and sat back in his chair. He removed his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth he pulled from his desk drawer, a gesture that seemed designed to give him time to organize his thoughts. "Ms. Morrison," he said finally, replacing his glasses and looking at her directly. "I need you to understand something before I go any further. What you brought me today is extremely unusual. I've been a gemologist for 37 years, and I've seen perhaps 3 collections of this quality in my entire career." Rachel's mouth went dry. "Are they real?" "Oh yes, they're real, and they're extraordinary." He pulled out a notepad and began writing figures, speaking as he did. "The 12 loose stones in the first pouch are all natural diamonds, clarity ranging from VS1 to IF, color grades D through F. The cuts are old European style, which is consistent with your grandmother's time frame. Each stone would have been hand-cut by a master craftsman. The smallest is approximately 2 carats. The largest is just over 5. He moved to the necklace. "This piece is extraordinary. Platinum setting, which was expensive even when it was made. 47 diamonds total. The center stone is 8 carats, flawless clarity, D color. The smaller stones are graduated, all perfectly matched. The craftsmanship is museum quality." Rachel felt dizzy. "How much are they worth?" Eisenberg paused, his pen hovering over the notepad. "I can't give you an exact figure without a complete appraisal, which would require several days and probably consultation with colleagues. But speaking conservatively, based on what I'm seeing right now." He wrote a number and turned the pad toward her. Rachel stared at the figure. Her vision tunneled. The room felt too small, too hot, too bright. "That's just for these 3 items," Eisenberg continued, his voice gentle. "You mentioned there were more pieces in the wardrobe." Rachel nodded, unable to speak. "Ms. Morrison, I need to be very clear with you. What you have is not just valuable. It's extraordinary, and that means you need to take certain precautions. You can't walk around carrying these in a backpack. You need proper insurance, secure storage, probably legal advice about how to manage an inheritance of this size." He pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. "This is a number for a colleague who specializes in estate management. I'd also recommend you speak with an attorney who handles high-value inheritances. This isn't just about money. There are tax implications, legal requirements, security concerns." Rachel took the card with numb fingers. The number he'd written on the notepad burned in her vision. For $1,200,000. For 3 items. And she had 20 more waiting in the wardrobe. She started, then stopped, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." Eisenberg's expression softened. "You take a breath. You don't make any hasty decisions. And you let experts help you navigate this properly. Your grandmother protected these items for over 60 years. She trusted you to handle them wisely. That means taking your time, being careful, making smart choices." He began wrapping the items again, his movements careful and precise. "I'd like to do a complete appraisal of everything you found. It would take about a week, and there would be a fee, but it would give you documentation you'll need for insurance and estate purposes. In the meantime, these items should be in a safe deposit box, not in your apartment." Rachel nodded, trying to process information that felt like it was coming from very far away. For $1 million. For 3 items. The math became impossible when she tried to project it across everything she'd found. 23 items. Some with multiple stones. Some with settings that were probably as valuable as the diamonds themselves. "Ms. Morrison?" Eisenberg's voice was patient. "Do you need a moment?" "Yes," Rachel whispered. "I think I do." He left the room discreetly, and Rachel sat alone with the wrapped bundles and the number on the notepad and the knowledge that her entire life had changed in the space of a single day. Outside the office window, Philadelphia continued its ordinary afternoon. People walked past on their way to jobs and appointments. Cars waited at traffic lights. Someone sold pretzels from a cart on the corner, calling out prices to passers-by who barely looked up from their phones. None of them knew that 4 floors above them, a woman who'd been evicted twice and had $43 in her bank account had just learned she was sitting with millions of dollars of diamonds in her lap. Rachel pressed her hands against her face and let herself cry again, but this time not from grief or shock. From relief. From gratitude. From the overwhelming weight of being chosen, of being trusted, of being the one her grandmother had known would understand. When Eisenberg returned with a glass of water and a box of tissues, Rachel had composed herself enough to discuss next steps. They scheduled appointments for a complete appraisal. He gave her the name of a bank where she could open a safe deposit box that afternoon. He made her promise not to tell anyone about the diamonds until she had proper legal and financial advice. "Your family doesn't know what you found?" he asked. "No. They all thought the wardrobe was worthless. They laughed at me for taking it." Something that might have been a smile crossed his face. "Well, I suspect their opinion may change eventually. But for now, the fewer people who know, the safer you'll be." Rachel left his office at 4:30, her backpack feeling simultaneously lighter and heavier than when she'd arrived. She followed Eisenberg's directions to the bank, where a patient representative helped her open a safe deposit box and store the 3 items she'd brought. The representative asked no questions about the wrapped bundles, maintained professional discretion, and gave Rachel a key that felt weighted with more than just metal. The subway ride home felt surreal. She sat among people returning from work, their faces tired and preoccupied, and tried to appear just as ordinary, just as unremarkable. No one looked at her twice. No one suspected that the woman in worn jeans and a jacket with a fraying cuff had just stored millions of dollars in a bank vault. When she reached her apartment, unlocking the door with fingers that still trembled slightly, the wardrobe greeted her exactly as she'd left it. Solid, immovable, keeping its secrets. Rachel approached it slowly and opened the doors. She reached for the hidden mechanism, turned the carved circle, and opened the false back panel. The remaining items waited in their velvet-lined cavity, untouched, patient. She didn't remove anything else. Not yet. Instead, she just looked at them, these objects that represented 3 generations of survival, 3 generations of women who'd understood that some things were worth protecting even when the world demanded you surrender everything. Her phone buzzed. A text for Vanessa. Dealer said he could go to $250 for the wardrobe. Final offer. Let me know. Rachel smiled and deleted the message. Then she closed the panel, closed the wardrobe doors, and sat on her bed with her back against the wall, looking at the piece of furniture everyone had dismissed as worthless. I'll protect them, she said quietly, speaking to her grandmother, to her great-grandmother, to all the women who'd come before and made choices that allowed this moment to exist. I promise. I'll be worthy of what you've given me. Outside, evening settled over Philadelphia. Streetlights flickered on. People returned to their homes, made dinner, settled into evening routines. And in a studio apartment in a building that had seen better days, a woman who'd been 3 days away from eviction sat beside a wardrobe that held the wealth of 3 generations and began planning not just how to survive, but how to live. What happens next, she'll discover in time. How the appraisal confirms what she already knows deep in her bones, that she's been entrusted with something extraordinary. How her family's reaction will unfold when they eventually learn what they dismissed. How she'll navigate a transformation from poverty to wealth, from failure to keeper of family legacy. But for now, in this moment, she simply sits in grateful silence and lets herself feel what she hasn't felt in years. Safe, chosen, trusted, home. The week that followed David Eisenberg's initial assessment felt like living in 2 parallel realities. In one, Rachel Morrison continued her life exactly as before, job searching, stretching her remaining dollars across meals that got simpler each day, avoiding her landlord's knowing looks when they passed in the hallway. In the other, she was the keeper of a fortune so vast she hadn't yet found the courage to fully comprehend it. She moved through her days with a strange, divided awareness, hyper-conscious of the wardrobe dominating her studio apartment, while simultaneously trying to appear utterly ordinary to everyone around her. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. Every time someone mentioned money, the cashier commenting on rising grocery prices, a neighbor complaining about utility bills, Rachel had to suppress the urge to laugh or cry or both. On Monday morning, 3 days after her first meeting with Eisenberg, she received a call from his office. Ms. Morrison, this is David Eisenberg. I've completed my preliminary assessment, and I'd like to schedule a time to discuss my findings. Would tomorrow at 10 a.m. work for you? Rachel's stomach tightened. Yes, that's fine. Excellent. I should mention that I've asked a colleague to join us, Dr. Patricia Chun. She's a specialist in antique jewelry and historical provenance. Given what you've brought me, I believe her expertise will be valuable. Of course, whatever you think is necessary. After hanging up, Rachel sat very still, staring at the wardrobe. Preliminary assessment. That meant he'd examined everything, cataloged it, assigned values. Tomorrow she would know exactly what her grandmother had hidden, exactly what her family had dismissed, exactly how completely the world had shifted beneath her feet. She spent that Monday in a state of suspended animation. She tried to distract herself with job applications, but couldn't focus. She attempted to read, but the words blurred together. Finally, she gave up and did what she'd been avoiding. She opened her grandmother's letter again and read it slowly, looking for clues she might have missed. True wealth is not what you display, but what you protect. The words hit differently now. Estelle had lived simply, worked hard jobs, never owned a car, never traveled, never bought expensive clothes. Her apartment in Fishtown had been clean but sparse, furnished with pieces from thrift stores and items other people had discarded. Rachel had assumed this was because Estelle had no choice, because poverty was the only reality available to her. But what if it had been a choice? What if Estelle had deliberately lived small, attracting no attention, raising no questions, protecting her secret through ordinary invisibility. The thought made Rachel's chest tight. How much had her grandmother sacrificed to keep these diamonds safe? What life might she have lived if she'd sold even a fraction of them? But Rachel knew the answer already. Estelle had lived exactly the life she'd chosen. She'd protected what her family had entrusted to her, honoring her mother's wishes, waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right generation to carry the burden forward. And she'd chosen Rachel. That night, Rachel did something she hadn't done since finding the diamonds. She opened the wardrobe's hidden panel again and examined each remaining item methodically. Not to appraise them. She'd leave that to Eisenberg, but to understand them as objects, as pieces of history that had been created by human hands and preserved through human determination. She unwrapped a brooch she hadn't looked at closely before. It was constructed in the shape of a flower, each petal made from a perfectly cut diamond. The center a larger stone that caught light and scattered it like morning dew. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Someone had spent hours, maybe days, creating this single piece, selecting stones that would work together, cutting and setting them with precision that bordered on obsession. She imagined her great-great-grandfather in his Warsaw workshop, bent over a jeweler's bench, creating this piece for a customer who would wear it to the opera or a state dinner, who would display it casually on a dress that cost more than most people earned in a year. That customer was probably long dead now, their name forgotten, their family scattered or destroyed by the same war that had driven Estelle's family into exile. But the brooch remained. Beauty had outlasted power. Craft had survived catastrophe. Rachel wrapped it carefully and returned it to its place, then moved to the next item. A ring with 3 stones arranged in a row, each one at least 2 carats, set in gold so pure it glowed even in the dim light of her apartment. A man's ring, substantial and masculine, probably made for someone of wealth and status. She wondered who it had belonged to. Had they survived the war? Had they sold it to her great-grandfather in desperate times, trying to buy passage out of Poland? Or had they died, and had their possessions been looted, scattered, eventually finding their way into the hands of people who knew how to hide value and weight? The stories embedded in these objects were vast and unknowable. All Rachel could do was honor them by ensuring they endured. She worked through the hidden cavities systematically, examining each piece, each wrapped bundle. By the time she finished, it was past midnight, and she had a clearer sense of what she was dealing with. Not just diamonds, but history. Not just wealth, but evidence of a world that had been destroyed and partially preserved. Tuesday morning arrived cold and gray. Rachel dressed carefully, choosing clothes that projected neither poverty nor wealth, that would allow her to blend into the professional environment of Eisenberg's office without drawing attention. She left her apartment at 9 o'clock, giving herself plenty of time to navigate the subway and arrive composed. The waiting room outside Eisenberg's office was empty when she arrived. The receptionist smiled professionally and told her to go right in. Rachel pushed open the heavy door and found Eisenberg seated at his desk with a woman she assumed was Dr. Patricia Chun. Chun was younger than Eisenberg, maybe mid-40s, with sharp eyes and an air of precise competence. She stood when Rachel entered, extending her hand. "Ms. Morrison, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. David has shared your grandmother's letter and the background of these pieces. I'm honored to be involved in documenting them properly." They settled into chairs arranged around Eisenberg's desk. Between them lay a thick folder and what looked like several spreadsheets covered in numbers. Eisenberg opened the folder and pulled out the first page. "Ms. Morrison, Dr. Chun, and I have spent the past week conducting a comprehensive appraisal of all 23 items you discovered in your grandmother's wardrobe. What I'm about to share with you is both the individual valuation of each piece and a total assessment of the collection." He paused, his expression serious. "Before I continue, I want to emphasize that everything we discuss today is confidential. Dr. Chun and I both maintain strict professional discretion, and we strongly advise you to limit who you share this information with until you've established proper legal and financial structures." Rachel nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. Eisenberg slid the first sheet across to her. "This is the complete inventory. Each item is listed with its description, age, provenance details based on your grandmother's letter and our analysis of the craftsmanship, and estimated market value based on current auction results for comparable pieces. Rachel's eyes moved down the list, but the numbers didn't register at first. Her brain refused to process them as real figures, treating them instead like abstract symbols that couldn't possibly represent actual value. The 12 loose stones from the first pouch, Eisenberg continued, his voice steady and professional, range in value from approximately $180,000 for the smallest to $950,000 for the 5-carat D-flawless stone. Total value for that pouch, $4.3 million. Rachel's vision tunneled. She gripped the arms of her chair. The diamond necklace you brought for initial assessment is valued at $6.8 million. The craftsmanship is exceptional, and the center stone alone is worth approximately $4.2 million. A piece of this quality would attract significant interest at auction from collectors and museums. Dr. Chin leaned forward, her expression gentle. Ms. Morrison, would you like some water? This is a lot to process. I'm fine, Rachel managed, though her voice sounded thin even to her own ears. Eisenberg continued through the list, item by item. The brooch shaped like a flower, $2.1 million. The 3-stone ring, $1.8 million. A pair of earrings Rachel barely remembered examining, $3.4 million. A tiara that looked like something from a museum, $8.9 million. The numbers accumulated with relentless precision. Each item represented wealth beyond anything Rachel had imagined. And there were 23 items. When Eisenberg reached the final entry, he set down the paper and pulled out a summary sheet. The total appraised value, based on conservative estimates of what these items would bring at auction, is $176,400,000. The room went very quiet. Rachel heard the words, understood them linguistically, but couldn't connect them to reality. $176 million. That wasn't a number that applied to real life. That was the kind of figure you saw in news articles about billionaire estates or corporate buyouts. It wasn't something that existed in a wardrobe in a studio apartment where the radiator clanked and the ceiling leaked when it rained. I know this is overwhelming, Eisenberg said gently. Take your time processing it. How? Rachel's voice came out as a whisper. How is this even possible? Dr. Chin answered. Your great-great-grandfather was, from what we could determine, one of the finest jewelers in Warsaw before the war. The pieces we've examined represent decades of work by a master craftsman. Some of these stones are so rare that we've only seen comparable examples in museum collections. She pulled out several photographs. This tiara, for example, features a central diamond with a particular crystalline structure that's extraordinarily rare. Based on the cut and style, I believe it was created sometime in the early 1920s, probably for a member of Polish nobility. How your family acquired it, whether it was commissioned or purchased later, we can't determine. But its historical and artistic value is immense. Eisenberg added, what makes this collection particularly valuable is not just the quality of individual stones, but the breadth and completeness of it. This represents a comprehensive archive of pre-war European jewelry craftsmanship. Museums would be interested in acquiring the entire collection intact. Rachel felt herself starting to shake. Museums? It's one option, Eisenberg said carefully. You could sell the collection to a museum or a private institution. You could sell individual pieces at auction. You could keep them and simply have them properly insured and stored. These are decisions you don't need to make today. Dr. Chin's expression was compassionate. Ms. Morrison, David shared your grandmother's letter with me. What she wrote about these pieces being survival, about protecting them for the right person, that resonates deeply with their historical significance. These items survived genocide, displacement, decades of secrecy. They represent not just monetary value, but cultural memory. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Whatever you decide to do with them, I hope you'll consider their historical importance. This collection tells a story about a world that was destroyed, about people who had the foresight to preserve beauty and value through catastrophe. That story matters beyond the dollars and cents. Rachel's hands were trembling so badly she had to clasp them together in her lap. I don't know what to do with this information. You don't have to know yet, Eisenberg reassured her. But you do need to take certain immediate steps. First, proper insurance. I can recommend a broker who specializes in high-value items. Second, legal counsel. You'll need an attorney who understands estate law and can help you navigate tax implications. Third, secure storage. These items cannot remain in your apartment. He pulled out several business cards. These are professionals I've worked with before, people I trust to handle situations like yours with discretion and expertise. I'd recommend you contact them this week. Rachel took the cards with numb fingers. The room felt too small, the air too thick. She stood abruptly. I need to think. I need to go. Both Eisenberg and Dr. Chin stood as well. Neither tried to stop her, but Eisenberg's voice was firm when he spoke. Ms. Morrison, please be careful. You're now responsible for an extraordinary collection. Don't discuss this with anyone until you have proper legal protection in place. And please, call me if you have questions or concerns. Day or night. Rachel nodded, gathered the papers they gave her, and left the office. She made it to the elevator before her legs started to give out. She leaned against the wall, breathing deeply, trying to ground herself in something real. $176 million. Hidden in a wardrobe, dismissed by everyone who'd seen it, protected by her grandmother for over 60 years. Now hers. The elevator opened onto the lobby. Rachel walked out into the bright afternoon, and the contrast between the normal world continuing around her and the knowledge she now carried felt impossible to reconcile. People walked past, concerned with ordinary problems, work deadlines, grocery shopping, traffic, rent. None of them knew that the woman standing frozen on the sidewalk was carrying documentation of a fortune that could change hundreds of lives. She took the subway home in a daze, clutching her backpack with the appraisal documents pressed against her chest. When she reached her apartment building, she climbed the 3 flights of stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. Inside her apartment, the wardrobe waited exactly where it had always been. Rachel closed the door behind her, locked it, then slid down to sit on the floor with her back against it. And finally, she let herself react. Not with tears this time, but with something that might have been laughter or might have been hysteria. It bubbled up from her chest and emerged as a sound somewhere between the two, echoing in the small space. $176 million. She'd been 3 days from eviction. She'd been down to her last jar of peanut butter. She'd been applying for jobs at fast food restaurants because she was out of options. And the entire time, she'd been sleeping 6 feet away from a fortune that could solve problems for generations. The absurdity of it broke something loose inside her. She laughed until she couldn't breathe, until her ribs hurt, until the laughter transformed back into tears, and she sat on her floor, crying with her arms wrapped around her knees. When the storm passed, she felt emptied out, hollowed, like all the fear and stress and desperation of the past 4 months had been purged from her system. She stood slowly, her body aching, and approached the wardrobe. She opened the doors and looked at the interior, now understanding what it truly held. Not just diamonds, not just money, but choice, freedom, the ability to live without fear, to help others, to honor her grandmother's sacrifice by building something meaningful. The responsibility of it settled over her shoulders like a physical weight. Her phone rang. Vanessa. Rachel stared at the screen, then made a decision. She answered. Hello. Rachel, hi. Look, I know you're probably still upset about Mom and everyone going through Grandma's house so quickly, but I want to check in. Are you doing okay? The concern in Vanessa's voice sounded genuine, which made what Rachel knew even harder to hold back. Her sister had no idea what she'd dismissed, what she'd laughed at, what she'd considered worthless. I'm fine, Rachel said, keeping her voice neutral. Hanging in there. Good. Listen, that dealer I mentioned? He said he could maybe go up to $300 for the wardrobe if it's in really good condition. I know you're attached to it, but Rachel, you need to be practical. You need money, and that thing is just taking up space. Rachel looked at the wardrobe, at the carved flowers her grandmother had touched for 6 decades, at the hidden panel concealing $176 million in diamonds. "I appreciate you trying to help," Rachel said carefully, "but I'm keeping it." Vanessa sighed. "Rachel, you can't afford sentiment right now. You're barely making rent. You're going to end up on the street again if you don't start making smart decisions." "I've made my decision. The wardrobe stays." "Fine. It's your life." Vanessa's voice had turned cold. "Just don't call me when you need money again." The line went dead. Rachel set her phone down and realized she was smiling. If Vanessa only knew. If any of them knew what they'd walked past, what they'd mocked, what they'd considered garbage. But they didn't know. And Rachel decided in that moment that they wouldn't know. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some things were meant to be protected, and her grandmother had taught her that protection sometimes meant silence. Over the next few days, Rachel followed Eisenberg's advice methodically. She contacted the insurance broker, who arranged coverage that cost more per month than Rachel's rent, but which protected the collection comprehensively. She met with an attorney specializing in estate law, a woman named Margaret Torres, who listened to Rachel's story with professional composure and then spent 2 hours explaining tax implications, legal structures, and strategies for managing sudden wealth. "The good news," Margaret said, "is that this is inheritance, not income. You won't pay income tax on the items themselves. But when you sell them, you'll pay capital gains on any appreciation in value since your grandmother acquired them, which could be substantial." She pulled out a calculator. "If we estimate conservatively that the original value was around $50 million in the 1940s when your great-great-grandfather created or acquired these pieces, and current value is $176 million, you're looking at approximately $126 million in capital gains. Federal capital gains tax is roughly 20% plus state taxes. That's about $28 million in taxes when you sell." Rachel felt dizzy. $28 million in taxes. Yes, which still leaves you with approximately $148 million after taxes. But this is why planning matters. We can structure sales strategically, potentially spread them across tax years, utilize charitable giving to reduce tax burden, establish trusts for long-term wealth preservation. There are options. Margaret leaned forward. "Rachel, I need to ask you something directly. What do you want to do with this wealth? Because the answer to that question determines how we proceed." Rachel thought about her grandmother's letter, about survival, about protection, about carrying light through darkness. "I want to help people," she said slowly. "People like me. People who've lost everything and need a second chance. But I also want to honor what my grandmother built. She lived simply and protected these items for someone who would understand their value beyond money. I want to do the same." Margaret nodded. "Then we structure things carefully. We create a foundation, establish clear guidelines for giving, ensure the principal is protected while generating income for charitable work. We make sure this wealth lasts not just for your lifetime, but for generations." They spent the next week working together, creating legal structures that would protect both Rachel and the collection. The process was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Every document Rachel signed felt like a step further from the life she'd known and deeper into a future she was still learning to imagine. The collection was moved from her apartment to a secure vault at a specialized facility that stored high-value items for museums and private collectors. Rachel went with the transport team, watching as each carefully packaged item was loaded into an armored truck, driven to a building that looked like a fortress, and placed in climate-controlled storage that cost $15,000 per month. The wardrobe itself remained in her apartment. Rachel couldn't bear to part with it, even though its hidden purpose had been fulfilled. It had protected her family's treasures for over 60 years. Now, it would protect something else. The memory of where she'd come from, a reminder that some things were worth keeping even when everyone else thought they were worthless. 3 weeks after the appraisal, Rachel did something she hadn't done in months. She allowed herself to imagine a future. She sat at her small kitchen table with a notebook and began writing. Not plans for spending money, plans for living meaningfully. She wrote about the foundation she would create, focused on helping people experiencing homelessness transition to stable housing. She wrote about scholarships for students whose families couldn't afford tuition. She wrote about preserving historical artifacts and supporting museums that told stories of displacement and survival. She wrote about her grandmother, about Estelle's life of quiet dignity and purposeful sacrifice, about how she would honor that legacy not by displaying wealth, but by using it to create the kind of world Estelle had hoped for when she'd fled Warsaw with nothing but determination and hidden diamonds. As she wrote, her phone rang. An unknown number. Rachel almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Hello." Rachel Morrison? A male voice, professional but uncertain. "Yes. This is Thomas Brennan from the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'm working on a story about estate discoveries and hidden valuables, and your name came up in some documents I was reviewing. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about an inheritance you recently received." Rachel's blood turned cold. "I'm sorry. Who gave you my name?" "I can't reveal my sources, but I understand you recently had a collection of jewelry appraised by David Eisenberg. I'm interested in learning more about how you came to possess these items." Rachel's mind raced. How'd he know? Eisenberg had assured her of complete confidentiality. Margaret Torres had warned her about keeping things private. Who had talked? "I don't have any comment," Rachel said, her voice tight. "Ms. Morrison, I understand this is sensitive, but the story is going to run whether you comment or not. It would be better if you shared your perspective." Rachel hung up. Her hands were shaking. She immediately called Margaret Torres. "We have a problem," Rachel said when the attorney answered. "A reporter from the Inquirer just called asking about the diamonds." Margaret's response was immediate and sharp. "Don't talk to anyone. Not family, not friends, not reporters. I'm sending you to a crisis communications specialist. This is exactly what we were trying to avoid." "But how did they find out?" "Could be a dozen ways. A clerk at the insurance company, someone at the bank, even someone at the storage facility. When you're dealing with values this high, word spreads in professional circles. We'll handle this, but Rachel, you need to prepare yourself. Once this becomes public, everything changes." That night, Rachel lay in bed staring at the ceiling, sleep impossible. She thought about Vanessa, about the cousins, about all the relatives who dismissed her and laughed at her choice. By morning, they would all know. The story would break, and the world would learn that the worthless wardrobe they'd mocked contained a fortune. She thought about Estelle, about 3 generations of women who'd kept this secret, who'd protected it through war and displacement and decades of ordinary life. They'd succeeded in preserving it. But could Rachel succeed in protecting what came next? The first message arrived at 6:23 a.m. "Vanessa, all caps, call me right now." Then Derek, "Is it true? Did you really find millions in Grandma's furniture?" Then Aunt Patricia, "Rachel, we need to talk about Grandma's estate. I think there may have been a mistake in how things were distributed." The messages came faster, each one more urgent, more demanding. By 8 a.m., Rachel had 37 unread texts and 14 missed calls. At 9 a.m., the Philadelphia Inquirer published their story, "Hidden Fortune. Local Woman Discovers $176 million in diamonds in Grandmother's Wardrobe." The article was surprisingly accurate. They'd gotten quotes from sources familiar with the appraisal, details about the collection's history, speculation about how the family had acquired the diamonds before the war. They'd even included a photograph of a wardrobe similar to Estelle's, with a caption asking readers to imagine what might be hiding in their own attics. Rachel's phone rang continuously. She stopped answering. She read through the texts, each one a variation on the same theme: shock, anger, accusation. How could she not have told them? Didn't they deserve to know? Shouldn't the estate be redistributed now that the true value is known? Only one text was different, from a number she didn't recognize. "Your grandmother would be proud of how you've protected her legacy. Don't let them take it from you. A friend." Rachel stared at that message for a long time, wondering who had sent it, and finding comfort in the knowledge that someone, somewhere, understood what she was trying to do. By noon, there were reporters outside her apartment building. Not many, just 2 with cameras, but enough that Rachel couldn't leave without being photographed, couldn't go about her life without documentation. She called Margaret Torres again. "They're outside my building. Stay inside. Say nothing. I'm getting a security consultant to help you manage this. In the meantime, forward all communication from family members to me." We may need restraining orders if they continue harassing you. Restraining orders? They're my family. Rachel, you're about to learn a hard truth about sudden wealth. It reveals who people really are. The family members contacting you right now aren't concerned about your well-being. They're concerned about what they think they're owed. Protect yourself. That afternoon, sitting alone in her apartment while reporters waited outside and her phone exploded with demand from relatives who'd never cared about her before, Rachel opened her grandmother's letter one more time. Be brave now. Be clever. And when the dark times come, because they always do, remember that you come from people who knew how to carry light through darkness. Dark times had come, sooner than Rachel expected, in a form she hadn't anticipated. But Estelle had prepared her, had chosen her specifically because she understood that protection sometimes meant resistance, that keeping something safe sometimes meant standing alone. Rachel stood, walked to the wardrobe, and placed her hand on the carved wood. The hidden panel was empty now, its contents secure in a vault across town. But the wardrobe itself remained solid and patient, a reminder of everything it represented. I won't let them take it, Rachel said quietly. I promise. Outside, the reporters continued their vigil. Family members continued their demands. The world that had dismissed her now wanted a piece of what they'd overlooked. But Rachel Morrison, who'd been mocked and pitted and considered a failure, stood her ground. She'd been chosen as keeper not just of diamonds, but of a legacy, and she would protect it the way her grandmother had, with patience, with silence, and with the understanding that some things were worth fighting for even when everyone else thought you were wrong. The law office of Torres and Associates occupied the third floor of a converted brownstone in Center City, Philadelphia. Rachel sat in the conference room, her hands folded on the polished oak table, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. Across from her sat Margaret Torres, her attorney, flanked by two associates whose names Rachel had already forgotten. To her left was David Eisenberg, present as expert witness to the collection's value and authenticity. And across the table, arranged like an opposing army, sat her family. Vanessa had brought her husband, Richard, a corporate attorney whose presence was clearly meant to intimidate. Derek had come with Aunt Patricia, both of them wearing expressions of righteous indignation. Uncle James sat at the end, his face carefully neutral, which somehow felt more threatening than the other's obvious anger. The conference room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of traffic from the street below. No one had spoken since they'd all taken their seats 5 minutes ago, each side waiting for the other to break first. Margaret Torres broke the silence with professional precision. Thank you all for coming today. I've asked you here because my client, Rachel Morrison, wanted to address certain concerns that have been raised since news of her inheritance became public. Before we begin, I need to establish some ground rules. She pulled out a thick folder. First, everything discussed in this room is subject to attorney-client privilege. Second, there will be no recordings of this meeting. Third, if anyone becomes hostile or threatening, this meeting will end immediately. Is that clear? Murmurs of agreement went around the table. Good. Now, my client has prepared a statement. Rachel's mouth was dry, but she forced herself to speak clearly. I know you're all upset. I know you feel like you should have been told about what was in the wardrobe, but I need you to understand something. I didn't know either. Not until after Grandma's estate was settled. Not until after you all laughed at me for keeping it. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice sharp. You could have told us when you found out. You could have called us immediately. Instead, you snuck around getting appraisals and moving things in a vault while we were left in the dark. I was following legal advice, Rachel said. Margaret told me not to discuss the discovery with anyone until proper structures were in place. How convenient, Derek interjected. Your lawyer told you to hide a fortune from your family. Margaret's voice cut through the rising tension. My advice was to protect my client from exactly what's happening right now. Within days of the discovery becoming public, Rachel received over 200 messages demanding money. She had reporters camped outside her apartment. She had distant relatives she hasn't spoken to in a decade suddenly claiming close relationships. My job is to ensure her legal rights are protected. What about our legal rights? Aunt Patricia's voice trembled with barely controlled anger. That collection belonged to Estelle. We're a family too. We're all entitled to a share. Uncle James spoke for the first time, his voice measured. Patricia is right. The estate was settled under the assumption that Estelle's possessions were of minimal value. Now we know there was a hidden asset worth nearly $200 million. That fundamentally changes the distribution. Margaret pulled out several documents. I'm glad you brought that up, because I have here the complete estate settlement documents, signed by all parties present in this room. Each of you agreed that you had received your portion of Estelle Morrison's estate and had no further claims. She slid copies across the table. Furthermore, I have Estelle's will, which is very clear about her intentions. She left specific items to specific people. Rachel received the wardrobe, along with its contents, whatever those contents might be. The language is explicit. Richard, Vanessa's husband, scanned the document. The will says, the mahogany wardrobe and its contents. That's ambiguous. It could be interpreted as just the furniture itself, not hidden valuables that weren't disclosed during probate. It could be interpreted that way, Margaret agreed. But it won't be. Pennsylvania law is clear on this point. When personal property is bequeathed, it includes everything within that property, whether visible or concealed, whether known to the executor or not. There's extensive case law supporting this. She pulled out more documents. Morrison versus Estate of Harris, 1987. Chun versus Chun, 2003. Rodriguez versus Estate of Rodriguez, 2015. In each case, courts ruled that hidden assets discovered in bequeathed property belonged to the recipient of that property, not to the estate. Vanessa's face had gone red. So, you're saying she gets to keep everything? Hundreds of millions of dollars, while the rest of us get nothing. You already received your portion of the estate, Margaret pointed out. You chose what you wanted from Estelle's belongings. Rachel chose the wardrobe. The fact that her choice turned out to be more valuable than expected doesn't entitle you to reconsider the distribution retroactively. Derek slammed his hand on the table. This is bullshit. She knew what was in there. She had to have known. Actually, David Eisenberg spoke for the first time, his voice calm and authoritative. I can speak to that directly. When Rachel first brought items to me for appraisal, it was clear she had no idea of their value. Her questions, her reactions, everything indicated genuine discovery. I've worked with enough people trying to authenticate found items to recognize the difference between someone who knows what they have and someone who's hoping they've found something valuable. Rachel was in the latter category. He pulled out his own documentation. Furthermore, based on my examination of the wardrobe's hidden compartment, the mechanism was expertly concealed. Without knowing exactly where to look and how to activate it, you would never find it. The fact that Rachel discovered it was due to her careful examination of a piece she valued for sentimental reasons, not because she was treasure hunting. Uncle James was reading through Margaret's case law citations with uncomfortable attention. As someone who'd worked in banking his entire life, he knew how to read legal documents, and his expression was growing more troubled with each page. What are you really asking for here? Rachel asked, her voice stronger now. Do you want money? Is that all this is about? Vanessa looked at her like she'd said something offensive. Of course it's about money, Rachel. We're talking about nearly $200 million that should have been distributed among all of Estelle's heirs, not hoarded by one person who got lucky. Lucky? Rachel's voice rose despite her attempt to stay calm. You think I was lucky? I was 3 days from being evicted when I found those diamonds. I've been sleeping in my car 6 months earlier. I'd sold everything I owned just to eat. Where were you then, Vanessa? Where was your concern for family when I was homeless? Vanessa flinched, but didn't respond. Rachel continued, the words coming faster now. None of you wanted the wardrobe. You all laughed at me for keeping it. Derek said it was worthless. Patricia said I was being impractical. Vanessa, you texted me a dozen times trying to get me to sell it for $300. $300 for something worth $176 million. And now you want to claim you deserve a share? We didn't know, Derek started. Exactly. None of us knew. But I'm the one who took it. I'm the one who paid to move it. I'm the one who made space for it in an apartment the size of a closet. I'm the one who valued it enough to examine it carefully. If you'd been the one to take it, you would have found the same thing. But you didn't want it. You all chose other things. Aunt Patricia's voice was smaller now. Rachel, please. I'm not trying to be greedy, but I'm on a fixed income. My pension doesn't cover my medical expenses. Your grandmother would have wanted to help me. The appeal to Estelle's intentions hit harder than the legal arguments. Rachel's anger faded slightly, replaced by something more complex. Margaret sensed the shift and intervened. If we could take a brief recess, I'd like to speak with my client privately. The family members filed out, some reluctantly, some clearly relieved to escape the tension. When the conference room door closed, Margaret turned to Rachel. You're handling this well, but I need to ask, do you want to offer them anything? You're under no legal obligation, but sometimes these situations are resolved more amicably with a gesture of goodwill. Rachel was quiet for a long moment. What did my grandmother's letter say? That I should be brave and clever, that I should help people who need help. But it also said I should protect what matters. I don't know if giving my family money is protecting what matters or just giving it to people who are being greedy. David Eisenberg spoke gently. Your grandmother hid those diamonds for 60 years. She lived simply, never spending them, never revealing them. She made a choice about who should receive them, and she chose you. Not because you're the oldest or the most successful, but because she trusted you to understand their value beyond money. But Aunt Patricia is right about one thing, Rachel said slowly. Grandma would have wanted to help her. She helped everyone. She was the most generous person I knew. Then be generous on your own terms, Margaret advised. Don't let them bully you into thinking you owe them something legally. But if you want to help from a place of choice rather than obligation, that's different. When the family returned, Rachel had made a decision. She stood, and everyone fell silent. I've thought about what you've said, about what Grandma would have wanted, about what's fair. And here's what I'm going to do. She pulled out a sheet of paper she'd been working on during the recess. I'm creating a family fund. $5 million, distributed as follows. $1 million to Aunt Patricia to cover medical expenses and ensure a comfortable retirement. $500,000 to Uncle James for his daughter's college expenses, which I know has been a concern. $1 million split among my 3 cousins. And $2.5 million into a trust that will be available for any family member facing genuine financial hardship. The room went silent. Vanessa found her voice first. $5 million? Out of nearly $200 million. Yes, Rachel said firmly, because that's what I'm choosing to give, not what you're entitled to take. The rest of the collection stays with me, to be used according to my grandmother's wishes, to help people, to preserve history, to create something meaningful. Derek started to object, but Uncle James put a hand on his arm. Let her finish. Rachel continued. This offer comes with conditions. First, you all sign releases acknowledging that this is a voluntary gift, not a legal settlement, and that you have no further claims to Estelle's estate. Second, you agree to respect my privacy and stop harassing me. Third, you acknowledge that my grandmother made her choice deliberately and that I'm honoring her wishes by protecting the collection. And if we refuse? Derek asked. Margaret answered. Then my client offers nothing, and we proceed with litigation if you choose to contest the will, which, based on the case law I've shown you, you will lose. And you'll spend tens of thousands in legal fees to get nothing. Uncle James was reading Rachel's proposal carefully. This is more than fair, Rachel. More than I would have offered in your position. Thank you. Vanessa looked like she wanted to argue, but Richard was shaking his head slightly. He'd read the legal documents. He knew they had no case. One by one, they agreed. Derek grudgingly, Aunt Patricia with tears, Vanessa with barely concealed resentment. But they agreed. The paperwork was prepared over the next week. Rachel's $5 million gift was structured as irrevocable trusts and direct transfers, ensuring the money would be used for its intended purposes. In exchange, every family member who'd attended that meeting signed releases confirming they had no claim to the diamond collection. But the legal victory felt hollow. Rachel sat in her apartment the night after the final documents were signed, looking at the wardrobe, feeling no sense of triumph. Her phone rang. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Rachel Morrison? An elderly woman's voice, accented, warm. Yes. You don't know me, but I knew your grandmother. My name is Ruth Goldstein. I saw the newspaper article about the diamonds, and I wanted to reach out. Rachel's interest sharpened. How did you know my grandmother? We came over on the same boat in 1947. We were both 17, both alone, both refugees from Poland. We stayed in touch for many years before life took us in different directions. But I never forgot Estelle. Ruth paused. I want you to know something about your grandmother that maybe she never told you. She wasn't just protecting those diamonds for your family. She was protecting them for all of us, all the families who lost everything. I don't understand. In Warsaw, before the war, the Jewish community had a tradition. When times were dangerous, when we knew we might have to flee, families would pool their valuables with the most trusted jewelers. Your great-great-grandfather was one of those trusted men. Some of the diamonds in that collection weren't just your family's. They were held in trust, meant to be preserved until the families could reclaim them. Rachel felt dizzy. But those families, most didn't survive. Your grandmother knew that. She couldn't return the diamonds to people who were dead, to families that had been erased. So she kept them safe, hoping that someday they could be used to help others. She told me once, maybe 30 years ago, that if she ever found the right person to entrust them to, she would want those diamonds used to rebuild what was destroyed. Not just buildings or businesses, but hope, community, memory. Rachel was crying now, though she wasn't sure when the tears had started. She gave them to me. I know, and I read what you told that reporter, that you're planning to create a foundation for people who've lost everything. That's what Estelle wanted. That's what all of us who survived wanted, to turn survival into meaning. They talked for another hour. Ruth shared stories about Estelle that Rachel had never heard. About the boat crossing that had taken 3 weeks through rough seas. About the displacement camp in Brooklyn where they'd both lived for a year. About the jobs Estelle had worked, seamstress, house cleaner, factory worker, always sending money back to help other refugees, always giving what she could despite having so little. Your grandmother was the strongest person I ever knew, Ruth said finally. She carried more than just diamonds across the ocean. She carried responsibility, memory, hope. Now she's passed that to you. Use it well, Rachel. Make her proud. After they hung up, Rachel sat in silence for a long time. Then she pulled out her notebook and began writing again. Not plans for herself, but plans for the foundation she would create. Plans that honored not just her grandmother, but all the families whose treasures had been preserved in that wardrobe. The next morning, Rachel met with Margaret Torres and a foundation specialist named Dr. Howard Chin. Together, they began the complex work of establishing the Estelle Morrison Foundation, dedicated to helping refugees, displaced persons, and people experiencing homelessness rebuild their lives. We'll need to establish clear guidelines, Dr. Chin explained. What types of assistance you'll provide, how applications will be evaluated, how funds will be distributed. This is important work, but it needs structure to be sustainable. They worked for weeks, crafting mission statements, establishing application processes, setting up advisory boards. Rachel donated $50 million of the collection to the foundation as its initial endowment, ensuring it would have the resources to operate for decades. But even as she built something meaningful, the public attention continued to grow. The story of the hidden diamonds had captured imaginations. Rachel received hundreds of letters, some from people genuinely in need, some from scammers, some from historians wanting to know more about the collection's origins. 3 months after the discovery, the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York contacted her. They wanted to create an exhibition about the collection, about her family's story, about the broader history of how European Jewish families preserved wealth and culture through genocide and displacement. Rachel agreed, on the condition that the exhibition would be free to the public and would include education programs about refugee experiences and historical preservation. The exhibition, Hidden Treasures, Preserved Memory, the Morrison Collection, opened 6 months later. Rachel stood in the gallery, surrounded by items her grandmother had hidden for 60 years, now displayed in climate-controlled cases with detailed placards explaining their history and significance. Beside the diamond necklace worth $6.8 million was a photograph of Estelle at age 20, standing in front of the wardrobe in her Brooklyn apartment, her expression serious and determined. The placard read, Estelle Morrison, 1930 to 2023, preserve these items not for personal wealth, but as testimony to a world that was destroyed and partially saved. Rachel stood in front of that photograph for a long time, looking at her grandmother's young face, seeing the weight she'd carried, the choices she'd made, the burden she'd honored until she could pass it forward. She would be proud of you. Rachel turned to find an elderly man standing beside her, leaning on a cane, his eyes fixed on the photograph. Did you know her? Rachel asked. Briefly, many years ago. I'm Isaac Rothenberg. Your great-great-grandfather made a ring for my grandfather in 1932. I've often wondered what happened to the Rothstein workshop after the war. Now I know at least part of the story. He gestured to the exhibition. This is important work you're doing. Not just displaying beautiful objects, but telling the story of how beauty survives catastrophe. How people protect what matters even when the world tells them nothing matters anymore. They walked through the exhibition together, Isaac sharing memories of pre-war Warsaw that he'd heard from his own grandparents, Rachel listening and learning about the world her family had come from. When they reached the final room, where the most valuable pieces were displayed, including the tiara worth $8.9 million, Isaac paused. You know, the monetary value of these items is extraordinary, but it's not what makes them precious. What makes them precious is that they represent choice. Your great-great-grandfather chose to save these rather than cash. Your great-grandmother chose to carry them across oceans. Your grandmother chose to keep them hidden, and you've chosen to share them. Each choice a rejection of despair, an insistence that beauty and value can endure. Rachel felt tears on her cheeks. I'm trying to honor what they started. You're doing more than that. You're completing it. They preserved value through the darkness. You're using that value to bring light. That's transformation, not just preservation. Over the following months, the foundation began its work. The first recipients were 3 families experiencing homelessness in Philadelphia, each provided with transitional housing, job training, and financial support for up to 2 years. Rachel met each family personally, listening to their stories, understanding their struggles. She saw herself in their fear and their hope, remembered what it felt like to sleep in a car, to wonder if tomorrow would bring eviction or opportunity. One recipient was a woman named Elena Santos, a single mother of 2 who'd lost her job and apartment within the same month. She stood in Rachel's office, afraid to sit in the nice chair, clearly uncomfortable accepting help. I don't understand why you're helping me, Elena said. You don't know me. Rachel smiled. My grandmother taught me something. She taught me that survival is a gift that demands to be shared. She survived when millions didn't. She carried that survival forward by protecting something valuable so that someday it could help others survive their own dark times. You're not taking charity, Elena. You're receiving what someone fought very hard to preserve so it could reach you. 6 months later, Elena had secured full-time employment in her own apartment. She brought her daughters to meet Rachel, both girls shy but smiling. They're doing well in school now, Elena reported. Stable housing, regular meals. It's amazing what's possible when you're not just trying to survive every day. I want them to have what I didn't, a childhood where they feel safe. As Rachel watched Elena's daughters play in the foundation's reception area, she thought about her grandmother's letter, about carrying light through darkness, about protecting what matters, about being brave and clever and better than the circumstances that try to break you. The collection had been appraised at $176 million. Rachel had given $5 million to family, $50 million to the foundation's endowment, and allocated another $30 million for immediate program funding. She'd sold several pieces at auction to generate the necessary liquidity, each sale carefully structured to minimize tax burden while maximizing the funds available for helping others. But even after all those allocations, she still had significant wealth remaining. Wealth that had once seemed impossible, overwhelming, more than one person could ever need. She used portions of it to fund her own life comfortably, but simply: a modest apartment in a better neighborhood, a reliable car, the security of knowing she'd never be homeless again. But the bulk remained invested, growing, waiting to do more good. She thought often about what Dr. Chun had said, that the collection represented not just monetary value, but cultural memory. She'd kept certain pieces out of auction, preserving them for future exhibition, for education, for testimony that beauty could survive anything if someone was brave enough to protect it. The wardrobe remained in her apartment. She'd moved to a larger space, but the wardrobe came with her, still dominating whatever room it occupied, still reminding her daily of where she'd come from and why her grandmother had chosen her. Sometimes she opened the doors and looked at the now empty hidden cavity, remembering the night she discovered it, the way her hands had shaken as she pulled out that first wrapped bundle, the moment everything had changed. But the cavity wasn't quite empty. Rachel had placed something there, a copy of her grandmother's letter, sealed in protective plastic, alongside a letter of her own. To whoever finds this, Rachel had written, "This wardrobe once held a fortune. Now it holds only memory and meaning, which are perhaps the greater treasure. My grandmother, Estelle Morrison, taught me that true wealth is not what you display, but what you protect, not what you hoard, but what you give, not what you inherit, but what you build with what you've received." If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and someone new has been trusted with this piece of our family's history. I hope you'll understand, as I learn to understand, that some things matter more than money. That survival is a gift that demands to be shared. That every ending is also a beginning. Use whatever I've left wisely. Use it bravely. Use it to carry light through whatever darkness you face. And remember that you come from people who knew how to preserve what mattered most, even when the world tried to destroy everything. With hope for your future, Rachel Morrison. She'd signed it, dated it, and placed it in the cavity alongside her grandmother's words, creating a chain of memory and intention that extended across generations. The present moment, though, required her attention. Tomorrow, she had a meeting with the mayor's office about expanding the foundation's housing program. Next week, she was speaking at a conference about effective philanthropy. The month after, she'd be visiting Warsaw for the first time, seeing the street where her great-great-grandfather's workshop had stood, connecting with the past that made her present possible. But tonight, she sat in her apartment with the wardrobe nearby, comfortable in the knowledge that she'd made her grandmother proud. She'd protected what needed protecting. She'd shared what needed sharing. She'd transformed survival into something larger than herself. The phone rang. Another family approved for assistance. Another life about to change. Another opportunity to carry forward what Estelle had begun all those decades ago in a Warsaw workshop, preserving beauty and value and hope through chaos and destruction. Rachel answered the call, ready to continue the work, ready to honor the choice her grandmother had made, ready to prove that sometimes the things everyone else dismisses as worthless turn out to be exactly what the world needs most. And the wardrobe stood silent and patient, no longer guarding hidden treasure, but still protecting something precious, the memory of women who'd understood that true wealth is measured not in diamonds, but in the courage to protect what matters and the wisdom to share it generously. The conference room at the Estelle Morrison Foundation headquarters was nothing like Rachel Morrison had imagined when she'd first started planning the organization. She'd envisioned something modest, a few desks, maybe a small staff, enough to process applications and distribute funds. Instead, she now stood in a bright, modern space overlooking Philadelphia's waterfront, surrounded by a team of 15 dedicated professionals, each one committed to the Foundation's mission of helping people rebuild their lives after crisis. Okay, let's review our impact numbers for the year, Rachel said, pulling up a presentation on the large screen at the front of the room. As of this morning, the Estelle Morrison Foundation has assisted 247 families transition from homelessness to stable housing. Our job training programs have placed 183 people in sustainable employment. Our education grants have supported 94 students from refugee and displaced families to attend college. Maria Santos, the Foundation's program director, added details. Average time from entry into our program to housing stability is now 11 months, down from 16 months when we started. Success rate for maintaining housing after 2 years is 87%. That's significantly higher than the national average of 62%. Rachel looked at the numbers with quiet satisfaction. 2 years ago, she'd been one statistical failure, one eviction notice away from becoming a permanent casualty of circumstance. Now she was reading statistics about hundreds of people whose trajectories had shifted because her grandmother had been brave enough to hide diamonds in a wardrobe and patient enough to wait 60 years for the right person to find them. There's something else. James Wu, the foundation's financial director, spoke up. The investment portfolio has performed better than projected. With careful management and the proceeds from last quarter's auction of 3 collection pieces, our endowment has actually grown. We're now at $67 million, up from the initial $50 million donation 2 years ago. Rachel smiled. Her grandmother had protected value for 6 decades. Now that value was protecting others and growing in the process, ensuring the foundation could continue its work for generations. After the meeting, Rachel returned to her office, a modest space she deliberately kept smaller than the other executives' offices, decorated simply with photographs of families the foundation had helped and a single framed image of Estelle standing beside the wardrobe in 1963. Her assistant knocked on the open door. "Rachel, you have a visitor. She says it's personal, not foundation business." "A Dr. Miriam Kessler?" Rachel looked up, not recognizing the name. "Did she say what it's about?" "Something about your great-great-grandfather's workshop in Warsaw. She's a historian researching pre-war Jewish artisans." "Send her in." Dr. Kessler was perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent eyes that assessed everything with academic precision. She carried a worn leather portfolio and moved with the careful deliberation of someone who understood the value of patience. "Ms. Morrison, thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I'm Miriam Kessler from the Institute for Holocaust Studies in Warsaw. I've been researching your family's history, and I've discovered something I believe you should know." She opened the portfolio and pulled out a photograph, its edges worn, its image faded but still clear. It showed a jewelry workshop, walls lined with tools and workbenches, light streaming through tall windows. In the center stood a man in his 40s, serious-faced, wearing a jeweler's apron. Beside him stood a young woman, perhaps 20, her eyes defiant despite the formal pose. "This is your great-great-grandfather, Merrick Rothstein, and his daughter Sarah, your great-grandmother." The photograph was taken in 1938, for years before the workshop was destroyed. Rachel studied the image, seeing her grandmother's eyes in Sarah's face, seeing the determination that had passed down through 3 generations. Dr. Kessler pulled out more documents. "I've spent 2 years piecing together what happened to the Rothstein workshop. Your great-great-grandfather was more than just a talented jeweler. He was one of the most respected craftsmen in Warsaw, commissioned by nobility, by wealthy collectors, by people who valued art as much as commerce." She laid out more photographs, jewelry pieces, workshop documents, ledgers with handwritten entries. But what made Merrick truly remarkable was what he did when the war came. He could have fled in 1939 when Germany invaded. He had the means, had contacts in other countries. Instead, he stayed and turned his workshop into what we might call an underground vault. Rachel leaned forward, listening intently. "Jewish families knew what was coming," Dr. Kessler continued. "They knew their property would be confiscated, their businesses destroyed, their wealth seized. Merrick offered them a service. He would separate precious stones from their settings, hide them, preserve them against the future. Not for profit, he charged nothing. He did it because he believed that cultural memory deserved protection, that beauty should survive even if people didn't." She pulled out a ledger, its pages yellowed and fragile. "This is Marek's record book. It lists every family who entrusted items to him, every piece he disassembled and hid. The entries stop in late 1942, just before he was taken to Treblinka." Rachel's hands trembled as she looked at the names written in careful script. Families she'd never heard of, People who trusted her great-great-grandfather with their most precious possessions, hoping against hope that something would survive. He never got to return any of it, Rachel said quietly. No, most of the families on this list were killed. But your great-grandmother, Sarah, survived. She managed to hide not just her own family's diamonds, but some of the pieces Merrick had been protecting for others. When she escaped to England, then to America, she brought what she could, preserved it, and eventually passed it to your grandmother. Dr. Kessler's eyes were soft with understanding. When I read about your grandmother's collection in the newspaper, I started researching. The styles, the cuts, the settings, many of them matched descriptions from these ledgers. Your grandmother wasn't just hiding family wealth, Ms. Morrison. She was protecting the last remnants of dozens of families who were destroyed. Rachel felt the weight of it settle over her like a physical presence. How many families? Based on my analysis of the collection and these records, at least 37 different families contributed items that eventually ended up in Estelle's care. Some pieces were created by your great-great-grandfather. Others were brought to him for safekeeping. All of them represent not just monetary value, but memory of a world that was deliberately erased. Rachel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Philadelphia skyline without really seeing it. 37 families. Generations of people who'd trusted her ancestor to protect what they couldn't carry, who'd hoped that somehow, impossibly, their treasures would outlast the catastrophe. And they had. Those diamonds had survived the Holocaust, survived 6 decades of hiding, survived the casual dismissal of relatives who couldn't see value unless it announced itself loudly. They'd survived because women like Sarah and Estelle understood that protection sometimes meant sacrifice, that preservation sometimes meant living simply so that others might someday live abundantly. There's something else, Dr. Kessler said gently. Using this ledger and other records, I've been able to trace some surviving descendants of the families who entrusted items to Merrick. Not many. The Holocaust was thorough in its destruction. But there are a few people alive today whose grandparents or great-grandparents are listed in this book. Rachel turned from the window. They should know. They should know their family's treasures survived. That's why I came to you. I didn't want to make contact without your knowledge. Legally, you own the collection free and clear. But morally, ethically, I thought you should know the full story before deciding what to do. Rachel sat down again, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. How many descendants have you found? 7 families, scattered across 3 continents. Some are doing well financially, some are struggling, but all of them carry the weight of being the last link to families that were destroyed. To be able to tell them that something tangible survived, something their ancestors valued enough to try to save. Dr. Kessler's voice broke slightly. That would mean more than I can express. Rachel looked at the photograph of Merrick in his workshop, at the serious eyes that had seen catastrophe coming and chosen courage over escape. My grandmother's letter said I should use this wealth to help people, to rebuild what was destroyed. I think she knew, even if she never said it explicitly, that this was bigger than our family alone. She stood decisively. Contact the descendants. Tell them about the collection, about their ancestors' courage in trying to preserve beauty through horror, and ask them to come to Philadelphia. I want to meet them. I want to return what's theirs. Dr. Kessler's eyes filled with tears. Return? Rachel, you're not obligated. I know, but that's exactly why it matters. My grandmother protected these items for 60 years, waiting for someone who would understand their true value. I understand now. The value isn't in keeping them. It's in honoring why they were saved in the first place. Over the next 3 months, Rachel worked with Dr. Kessler to organize what they called the Recognition Gathering. 7 families whose ancestors had entrusted items to Merrick Rothstein were invited to Philadelphia, their travel and accommodations covered by the foundation. They came from Israel, from England, from Argentina, from California, scattered remnants of families that had once been whole. They ranged in age from a 78-year-old man who'd been hidden as a baby during the war to a 26-year-old woman who'd grown up knowing her family's history only through fragmented stories and faded photographs. The gathering was held at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, where the Morrison Collection exhibition had been updated to include the new historical research. Rachel stood in the gallery, watching the descendants arrive, seeing their faces as they encountered items that had belonged to their ancestors. A woman named Hannah Rosen stood transfixed before a brooch featuring a cluster of diamonds arranged like a flower. "My great-grandmother wore this in her wedding photo," she whispered. "I have a copy of that photograph at home. I've looked at it hundreds of times, wondering what happened to the brooch. And here it is. It survived. It survived when she didn't." Rachel approached her gently. "Your great-grandmother entrusted it to my great-great-grandfather in 1941. He preserved it, and my grandmother protected it for 60 years. It's yours, Hannah. It was always yours. We were just keeping it safe until you could reclaim it." Hannah turned to her, tears streaming down her face. "You're giving it to me? But the value? The value is in returning it to someone who understands what it represents. Memory, family, survival. I have more wealth than I need, Hannah. You have a right to something that belonged to your family. That's worth more than any price tag." Similar scenes played out across the gallery. A ring returned to the grandson of the man who'd commissioned it. Earrings given back to a family who'd thought every trace of their ancestors had been destroyed. A necklace that brought a 70-year-old man to his knees with grief and gratitude. Not every item in the collection could be traced to a specific family. Some pieces Merrick had created himself, intended for customers who never came to claim them. Others came from sources too obscure to track after 8 decades. Those pieces Rachel kept, preserving them for education and exhibition, ensuring the story they told would endure. The items she returned were valued at approximately $23 million. It was the single largest donation Rachel had made, and it generated exactly 0 tax benefits because she asked for nothing in return. No receipt, no charitable deduction, just the quiet satisfaction of completion. The media covered the story extensively. "Heiress returns millions to Holocaust survivors' families," read one headline. "Beyond wealth. The moral choice one woman made," read another. Rachel did a few interviews, carefully explaining that she wasn't being heroic, just finishing what her ancestors had started. "My great-great-grandfather protected these items because he believed beauty and memory deserved to survive," she told one reporter. "My great-grandmother and grandmother continued that protection through decades of silence and secrecy. I'm just the last link in the chain, making sure the items reached the people they were always meant for." But even as she downplayed her role, the impact rippled outward in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Donations to the foundation increased dramatically, not from wealthy philanthropists, but from ordinary people inspired by the story of protection and return. Small donations of $25, $50, $100, each one representing someone who understood that true wealth lies in what you give, not what you keep. The foundation's work expanded. In addition to housing assistance, they launched a program specifically for refugees and displaced persons, helping people who'd lost everything in conflicts around the world. They created a cultural preservation initiative, documenting and protecting the stories and artifacts of communities at risk. They funded education programs, teaching young people about the importance of protecting cultural memory. Rachel hired staff members who'd personally experienced homelessness, who understood the system from the inside because they'd navigated it themselves. She created pathways for foundation recipients to become foundation employees, turning survival into expertise and expertise into service. One of those employees was Elena Santos, the single mother Rachel had helped 2 years earlier. Elena now directed the foundation's housing placement program, using her own experience to design more effective support systems. "I know what it's like to feel like you're invisible," Elena told new staff members during training. "I know what it feels like when the world treats you like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be helped. We don't do that here. Every person who comes through our door is someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone who matters. We treat them that way." 2.5 years after finding the diamonds, Rachel was invited to speak at a national conference on effective philanthropy. She stood before an audience of foundation executives, wealthy donors, and nonprofit leaders, and told her story with the honesty that had become her trademark. "I didn't find wealth because I was smart or deserving," she began. "I found it because I was desperate enough to keep something everyone else dismissed and curious enough to examine it carefully. The real question isn't how I got the money. That was accident and inheritance. The real question is what I chose to do with it." She clicked through slides showing the foundation's work. Families in stable housing, students graduating from college, refugees rebuilding lives in new countries. "My grandmother's letter told me that true wealth is what you protect and what you give. 2 years ago, I thought that meant protecting the diamonds and giving away money. I understand now it means something bigger." She paused, looking out at the audience. "It means protecting people's dignity when the world tries to strip it away. It means protecting memory when catastrophe tries to erase it. It means protecting hope when circumstances make hope seem foolish. And it means giving not just money, but opportunity. Not just assistance, but agency. Not just help, but respect." The response was overwhelming. Standing ovation, requests for interviews, invitations to advise other foundations on effective giving. Rachel accepted some opportunities and declined others, always remembering that her legitimacy came not from wealth, but from having lived the experience her foundation addressed. She still lived modestly by billionaire standards. A comfortable apartment, yes, but not a mansion. A reliable car, not a luxury vehicle. Nice clothes, but nothing ostentatious. She'd learned from her grandmother that quiet dignity is stronger than loud display. That true security comes from knowing you've used what you have wisely, not from accumulating more than you can ever use. The wardrobe remained in her living room, as much a part of her home as the furniture she sat on or the bed she slept in. Friends asked why she kept such a large, impractical piece, why she didn't replace it with something modern and functional. "It reminds me where I came from," Rachel always answered. "And more importantly, it reminds me why I'm here." She'd added something to its interior, a small plaque attached to the back panel, right where the hidden compartment had been. "In memory of Merrick Rothstein, Sarah Rothstein, and Estelle Morrison, who understood that protection is an act of love, and that love sometimes means keeping secrets until the right moment arrives to reveal them." On the 3rd anniversary of finding the diamonds, Rachel did something she'd been planning for months. She returned to the apartment building where she'd lived when everything changed. The landlord recognized her immediately. "Ms. Morrison, what brings you back here?" "I want to buy the building," Rachel said simply. The landlord's eyes widened. "Buy it? The whole building?" "Yes. I want to turn it into transitional housing for families moving out of homelessness. Affordable rent, support services on site, a place where people can rebuild without the constant fear of eviction." Within 2 months, the purchase was complete. Rachel renovated the building carefully, preserving its character while updating its systems. The studio apartment where she'd lived, where she discovered the diamonds, she kept exactly as it had been, wardrobe included, and turned into a small museum space documenting her grandmother's story and the foundation's work. Families began moving in. Single mothers escaping domestic violence. Refugees starting over in a new country. People who'd lost jobs and homes but hadn't lost hope. Each one received not just housing, but comprehensive support designed to address the root causes of instability rather than just its symptoms. Rachel visited the building often, sometimes just sitting in her old apartment, looking at the wardrobe, remembering what it felt like to stand in this room with $43 in her bank account and no idea that her entire life was about to change. One evening, she found a young mother sitting on the floor of the hallway, her daughter asleep on her lap, looking exhausted and overwhelmed. Rachel sat down beside her without introduction. "I know this is hard," Rachel said quietly. "I know it feels like you'll never get ahead, like every step forward gets pushed back by 2 steps of bad luck or bad circumstances." The woman looked at her, too tired to be curious about who this stranger was. "How do you know?" "Because I was you. 3 years ago, I was sleeping in my car with $43 to my name, wondering if I'd ever have a real home again." The woman's eyes widened as recognition dawned. You're the woman who found the diamonds. You own this building. I do. And I want you to know something. You're not here because you're getting charity. You're here because you're getting what should have been available to you all along. A safe place to live, support to rebuild, and the time and space to discover that you're capable of more than just surviving. You're capable of thriving. They sat together in the hallway, two women who understood what it meant to fight through darkness, until the little girl woke up and it was time to move forward into whatever came next. 4 years after the discovery, the Foundation published its first comprehensive impact report. The numbers told a story of transformation. 627 families assisted into stable housing. 89% still housed after 3 years. 412 people employed through job training programs. 203 students supported through education grants. 47 refugees resettled and integrated into communities. $127 million in total assistance provided. Foundation endowment grown to $89 million through strategic management. But beyond the numbers were the stories. Elena Santos now owned her own home and was putting both daughters through college. Marcus Webb from the first cohort had become a Foundation board member, using his lived experience to shape programs. Hannah Rosen, who'd reclaimed her great-grandmother's brooch, had donated it back to the museum collection with a request that it be displayed with her family story attached, so that others could learn what survival and preservation look like. Rachel stood at the museum gallery during a special program marking the collection's 4th anniversary. Students from local schools filled the space, listening to descendants of Holocaust victims talk about their families, about loss and preservation, about the importance of protecting memory. A 10-year-old girl approached Rachel afterward. "Did your grandmother really hide all those diamonds for 60 years? "She did." "Why?" Rachel knelt to the girl's level. Because she understood that some things are worth protecting even when nobody else understands their value. And she wanted to wait until she could give them to someone who would use them wisely. "How did she know you'd use them wisely?" Rachel smiled. "I think she just hoped. She took a chance that if she raised me to understand what really matters, kindness, courage, helping others, then I'd make good choices when the time came. She believed in me before I believed in myself." The girl thought about this seriously. "I think she was right." "I think so too." That night, Rachel returned to her apartment and sat with her grandmother's letter one last time. She'd read it hundreds of times over the past 4 years, but it still had the power to move her, to remind her of the responsibility she'd inherited along with the wealth. Be brave now. Be clever. And when the dark times come, because they always do, remember that you come from people who knew how to carry light through darkness. She'd been brave, she thought. Perhaps not in grand dramatic ways, but in the small daily choices to use wealth for good, to honor commitments, to protect what mattered. She'd been clever, structuring the foundation for long-term sustainability, making strategic decisions that multiplied impact. And she'd carried light through darkness. Not her own darkness anymore, but the darkness faced by hundreds of people who needed someone to believe their lives were worth rebuilding. The wardrobe stood against the wall, silent and patient as always. Rachel walked over to it and rested her hand on the carved wood, feeling the connection that stretched back through generations. "I hope I made you proud, Grandma," she said quietly. "I hope you're somewhere seeing what we built with what you protected. I hope you know it mattered." And in the silence that followed, Rachel felt something she could only describe as peace. Not the absence of challenges. The Foundation faced constant demands. The work was never finished. There were always more people who needed help than resources available to provide it. But peace in knowing she was doing the work she was meant to do, honoring the trust that had been placed in her, carrying forward a legacy that stretched back to a Warsaw workshop where a jeweler had chosen courage over escape. 5 years after finding the diamonds, Rachel organized one final event, a gathering of everyone whose life had been directly touched by the Estelle Morrison Foundation. Recipients, staff members, donors, volunteers, family members. Over 400 people filled a waterfront venue in Philadelphia on a bright May afternoon. Rachel stood at a simple podium, looking out at faces that represented transformation, hope, and the ripple effects of choosing kindness over fear. My grandmother used to say that survival is a gift that demands to be shared, Rachel began. For 60 years, she protected that gift, waiting for the right moment to pass it forward. She gave it to me not because I was perfect or deserving, but because she believed I would understand what it meant and what to do with it. She gestured to the crowd. Looking at all of you, I see that she was right. The diamonds she protected have become homes and jobs and education and dignity and hope. They've become second chances and new beginnings and proof that our circumstances don't define our worth. Elena Santos stood from the audience. Can I say something? Rachel nodded, stepping back from the microphone. Elena's voice was strong and clear. 5 years ago, I was sleeping in my car with my 2 daughters, wondering if we'd ever have a real home again. Today, I own a house. My daughters are thriving. I have a career helping others the way Rachel helped me. And I want everyone in this room to understand something. This isn't about one person being generous. This is about understanding that we're all connected, that one person's survival can become another person's opportunity, that protection and generosity create circles that expand outward forever. She turned to Rachel. You gave us more than money or housing. You gave us the message that our lives mattered, that we were worth investing in. That's what your grandmother gave you. And that's what you've given to hundreds of people. The applause was thunderous. Rachel felt tears on her cheeks, but didn't try to hide them. Marcus Webb stood next, then Hannah Rosen, then a refugee family from Syria, then a college student whose education had been funded by the foundation. One by one, people stood and told their stories, not just of assistance received, but of lives rebuilt, of dreams reclaimed, of futures that had seemed impossible becoming achievable. When the last person finished speaking, Rachel returned to the microphone. My grandmother's letter ended with these words, "Live well, live bravely, and when the dark times come, because they always do, remember that you come from people who knew how to carry light through darkness." She looked around at the gathering, at the faces illuminated by afternoon sun streaming through the windows. We all come from people who survived dark times. We all carry that survival forward. And the greatest honor we can give to those who protected us is to protect others in turn, to carry light, to share it, to prove that darkness, no matter how deep, can't extinguish the determined flame of human kindness. The gathering ended not with formal closure, but with organic conversations, connections forming between people who'd never met, but who shared the experience of transformation. Rachel moved through the crowd, listening more than speaking, witnessing the community that had formed around her grandmother's legacy. As evening fell and people began to leave, Rachel found herself alone in the venue for a moment. She stood at the window, looking out at Philadelphia's skyline, at the city where her grandmother had lived quietly for 60 years, protecting secrets, waiting for the right moment, believing that someday her sacrifice would matter. It had mattered, more than Estelle could ever have imagined. More than Rachel had comprehended when she'd first opened that false panel and found wrapped bundles containing impossible wealth. It had mattered not because of the dollar value or the beauty of the diamonds, but because it had proved something essential about human nature, that we can choose protection over greed, that we can choose patience over immediacy, that we can choose giving over hoarding, that we can choose to believe our lives have meaning beyond our own survival. Rachel's phone buzzed. A text from the foundation office. New application just came in. Single father, 2 kids evicted last week. Living in his truck. Story sounds familiar. Rachel smiled and typed her response. Schedule an intake meeting for tomorrow morning. And make sure he knows there's hope. Because that's what all of this was really about. Not diamonds or dollars or even philanthropy in its conventional sense. It was about hope. About believing that the human capacity for kindness could match the world's capacity for cruelty. About proving that survival wasn't just an ending, but a beginning. She left the venue and walked to her car, then paused. The wardrobe was at home, waiting as it always did. But tonight she didn't need to return to it to feel connected to her grandmother's legacy. The legacy wasn't in the furniture or even the foundation's work. It was in every person whose life had changed because someone chose to protect rather than exploit, to give rather than hoard, to believe that wealth's true value lay not in what it could buy, but in what it could build. Rachel drove through Philadelphia's streets, passing the building where she'd once faced eviction, the subway station where she'd ridden to job interviews that went nowhere, the park bench where she'd sat with her last $43, trying to decide between food and bus fare. All of it felt impossibly distant and intimately present at the same time. She'd walked those streets as someone invisible, someone the world had decided didn't matter. Now she walked them as someone with resources and influence. But the most important thing, the thing her grandmother had known and tried to teach her, was that her value hadn't changed between those 2 points. She'd mattered just as much when she had nothing as she did now, with millions at her disposal. The diamonds hadn't created worth. They just created opportunity to prove worth that had always existed. At home, she entered the apartment and greeted the wardrobe with the familiar affection of an old friend. She opened its doors, looked at the space where hidden wealth had once waited, and felt gratitude for all of it. The hiding, the waiting, the discovery, the choices that had followed. Tomorrow there would be more work, more families to help, more programs to develop, more ways to carry forward what Estelle had begun. But tonight, Rachel simply stood in the presence of everything that had brought her to this moment and whispered one final thank you to the grandmother who'd believed in her enough to trust her with transformation. The wardrobe stood silent and strong, its carved flowers catching lamplight the way they'd caught candlelight in Warsaw, electric light in Brooklyn, and now LED illumination in Rachel's modern apartment. Beauty enduring through all the changes, waiting patient and purposeful, reminding anyone who looked closely enough that the things everyone else dismisses as worthless are sometimes the things that matter most. And in a city full of people trying to survive another day, the Estelle Morrison Foundation continued its work, funded by diamonds that had survived genocide, carried by women who understood protection, and now deployed by someone who knew what it meant to have nothing and be given everything that truly mattered. The legacy wasn't finished. It was just beginning. And Rachel Morrison, who'd once stood in snow outside a bunker with a frozen key, who'd hidden in a wardrobe as a child, who'd been homeless and hopeless and dismissed, now carried forward the most important work of all, proving that second chances, given generously and received gratefully, could transform not just individual lives but entire communities. One family at a time, one choice at a time, one generous act at a time. The light kept spreading, carried forward by hands that understood both darkness and hope, both loss and preservation, both hiding and revealing at exactly the right moment, just as Estelle had always known it would. Thank you so much for watching this entire series. If you love this story of hidden treasure, family legacy, and transformation, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. What would you have done in Rachel's place? Let me know in the comments below. See you in the next story.